Okay, so this is section Fiscal Impacts of Aging, Part A. I'm Cássio Tur, I'll be the chair for the section. And we have 3 papers for today. Rafael Hoffman will be the discussant. So we'll start with a paper from Michael Abrigo, who is going to talk about how to finance universal health care in Philippines under a scenario of population aging. So please, Michael, you have the floor. 10 minutes, please.
Okay, here we go. This is a paper that I've started working on last year. We have a number of public reforms here in the Philippines, and one of it is the universal healthcare coverage in the Philippines. So as a brief background, we know that the Philippines is a young population. About 44% of its population is aged 25 to 64, but the Philippines is aging soon. By 2035, about 7% of the population will be age 60 and older. The favorable economic conditions in the past 2 decades, including the benefits we get from the first demographic dividend, coupled with fiscal reforms, allowed our government to allocate more resources to social services, particularly for education and health. This includes the expansion of our basic education from K plus 10 years to K plus 12 years, and introduction of a free tertiary education program in the Philippines in the public schools. More recently, just last year, we've also introduced a universal healthcare law, which essentially covers everyone in the National Health Insurance Program. While human capital investments are well and good, and they're important for us to benefit from the second demographic dividend, we know that there may be a need to temper government's distribution of entitlements based on at least 2 grounds. One is fiscal sustainability. Will we be able to afford these benefits, especially in the longer run? And second, generational equity. Will we be able to provide these services at the same level in the future once we have reached those aging? So the goal of the paper is simple. I just want to answer, how will population aging affect the resource requirement to finance universal health care in the Philippines? That is the main question that I want to answer. The key takeaways of the results that I have so far is that population aging has a direct and sizable effect on government finance, particularly here on healthcare, which in turn affects households who would finance government. Faster transition into aging society may not necessarily lead to greater and more abrupt healthcare financing burden, and I will show that later. And that broadening the tax base based on this idea in public economics, that having this broad tax base support government programs may decrease the burden on taxpayers despite population aging and even other more generous government transfer regimes. Just a brief introduction of the UHC law in the Philippines. The UHC law in the Philippines guarantees essentially equitable access to quality and affordable healthcare. So in this program, as I've mentioned earlier, all Filipinos are automatically covered by the National Health Insurance Program. Previously, around 2017, only around 80% of the Filipinos are covered by the NHIP, and these 80% covers mainly those who are employed in the formal sector and those in the dependents of these employed people. In the UHC law, there are 2 types of members. One, those contributing members and the non-contributing members. The non-contributing members, essentially those who are young, those who are age 18 years old, those who are old, 60 years and older, those who are poor. And more recently, they've changed a part of the policy, because originally everyone who is not either old or young or poor should be paying, but now they've also included overseas Filipino workers, essentially migrant workers, are exempted from paying, from contributing to the system. So included in the UHC law are also provisions to improve the health system, including scholarship program for healthy human resource, reorganization of health system, and so on. So who will benefit from the UHC, Universal Healthcare in the Philippines? Mainly the poor, because as shown in this table from 2017 Demographic and Health Survey, those poor, those in the lowest quintile by socioeconomic status, they usually have lower access to basic healthcare services, including antenatal care, deliveries by skilled provider, vaccinations. They also have lower financial risk protection. They're less likely to be covered by the health insurance, private or public, and they are more likely to suffer from catastrophic health spending. But in terms of population of who will be paying, mostly these people in the lowest quintile will not be paying because they are poor, so they are exempted from contributing to the National Health Insurance Program. So how is healthcare financed in the Philippines? This is based on the national health accounts for many countries. The red dot is the Philippines. So about 2/3 is financed by private, essentially out-of-pocket expenditures. But if you see the graph for all the countries in the world, there is a tendency for greater public participation, whether in terms of in-kind expenditures by government. So these are hospitals or clinics run by government, or social health insurance. There's a tendency for greater public participation as you go higher in the income class. But is private financing necessarily bad? As you can see here, for the change in how healthcare is financed between 2000 and 2015, even for many rich countries, there's some tendency towards more private financing over the last 15 years, and maybe because this is because of aging in many of these countries. In the Southeast Asian region, the only two countries that are off the trend is Philippines, and Vietnam is going towards more private financing, while the rest of Southeast Asia is going towards more public in-kind or social insurance type of financing. But it doesn't mean that the Philippines is going towards more private healthcare financing. Is that the government is not doing anything. The government is surely expanding its expenditures on health. It's just that over the last 25 years, much of the growth in healthcare financing is through private financing, and maybe this is because of the growth in income in the Philippines. So here, using NTA data, we try to disaggregate what drives aggregate healthcare expenditure in the Philippines. One is whether this is per capita, the effect of per capita health expenditures, just on average, the expenditure is increasing, or because of changing population age distribution. And I've disaggregated the last 25 years in two periods, 1995 to 2005, that would be the low growth regime, and 2005 to 2015, the high growth regime, where we are taking about 5, 6, 7% growth annually. And as you can see here in panel C, almost half of the growth in aggregate health expenditures between 1995 and 2005 is because of the change in population age distribution, while more recently, the change is more because people are just spending more per capita. Okay, so in order to answer my original question of what could potentially be the impact of population aging on universal healthcare spending in the Philippines, I use an NTA-based simulation. The goal is to project the contribution of changes in demography, government participation, longevity, and tax base on the burden of financing universal healthcare in the Philippines. Of course, there are a lot of simplification that goes through this simulation and this projection. One is that I'm assuming a fixed per capita age profile, and that the burden of disease remains the same in the Philippines. There would be no technology change. There's no behavioral change. And these are big assumptions, really. And the biggest one, of course, would be no behavioral change, because as we know, once you introduce these policies such as social health insurance, expansion of social health insurance, you would expect people to go more frequently to doctors and so on and so forth. So essentially, I'm assuming that we are stuck with 2015, with the year 2015, and not with this crazy 2020, but we're stuck with 2015. But we have a different people at different sets of people at different ages. Still, even with these major simplifications, I feel that this is a useful first cut to provide some guidance of what could be the potential direction of these changes in government participation and demography and whatnot. So how will population change in the Philippines in the next, 20 to 30 years? So here we introduced two scenarios. One is an aging and another is a faster aging scenario. These are based on the population projections of UN, so medium and the low fertility scenario. Well, what is evident here is that in both scenarios, the Philippines would be an aging society by 2035, but with a low fertility scenario, there would be less young and young adults by 2050. We also have some levers on how generous the government would like to be. So here, the gray shaded area is the total health expenditure, the per capita health expenditure by age in 2015, including public and private consumption. The solid black line would be the public expenditure in 2015 at baseline. In A, we have the scenario of what if we increase the social health insurance coverage to 100%. We're not changing the cost per person, we're just changing the coverage of how many people are included. So based on 2017 figures, this is about 20 to 30 million Filipinos added into the system by 2020. In scenario B, in addition to that 100% social health insurance coverage, what if the remaining expenditures that should have been covered by the households? What if there's a 70-30 co-insurance, 70 by the government, 30 by the households? So it means that the government is more generous in providing coverage. For reference, we're also including two thresholds from the WHO. One is the 40 PPP dollars and the 200 PPP dollars. WHO says that once you reach that 40 PPP dollars, your universal health coverage starts to improve, and by 200 international dollars, the change is more evident. Well,
1 minute.
we are changing the expenditures also by correcting for longevity, because we know that much of the health expenditures are expended in the last few years of life. So these are the results. So how much will UHC cost in the Philippines? Essentially a lot. As for reference, our Department of Health estimates that about 260 billion pesos will be used in the first few years. And here we are estimating 250 billion. So our estimates are quite close. But what is evident here is that, well, of course, if the government is more generous, then you would expect a greater expenditure. And there is, with demographic change, you would expect with aging, there is a substantial impact on the financial needs for the UHC. But if you're comparing the medium fertility scenario and the low fertility scenario, you would see that faster aging does not necessarily lead to greater burden, because, well, many of the children who would have need healthcare would not be born. So that leads to the decline in public health expenditures and health. You can also see here that the WHO thresholds are a good approximation, but there is a wide divergence in the estimate using the WHO thresholds and what we would get using NTA profiles, especially with more advanced aging. And these observations hold even if we correct for longevity. So that is the side of the government. But in terms of on the side of households, how much will people need to pay? I guess that is the more important question for people who will be supporting the health insurance, national health insurance program. Here I identified two classes of people who would be paying. One is I'm defining a broad labor income, which means all labor income that would be available in the economy, and the narrow labor income, where we restrict contributors to those who are working domestically, not young, not old, not poor, not overseas Filipino workers. And here you can see that if there would be a broader tax base, then as you would expect, there would be a smaller tax rate. So because the burden is shared more broadly. However, this holds true even under faster aging. For reference, our UHC law capped the contribution at 5% of labor income. But as you can see here, if you go from panel A to panel B, where you have a more generous, where you have the most generous program of 730 co-insurance, if we use the narrow labor income, then the 5% tax rate would not be enough, to cover the needs of the system. So going back to my takeaways based on the results, we see that population aging has a big effect on government finances, which affects household finances as well, and that faster transition into aging society may not necessarily lead to greater and more abrupt healthcare financing burden, and that broadening the tax base is actually good. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was a great presentation. Now we're going to have Gilbert Monchot, Julien Avot, Yves Carrière, and Marcel Meret, who are going to talk about the fiscal impact of immigration in Canada. Please, Gilbert, you have the floor.
So good morning and sorry for the delay. As you all know, population aging has become the intersection of heated debates in advanced economies. And one of the first one is the role of immigration, not only as the source of additional labor supply, but also as a possible solution to alleviate the pressure on public finances. While the impact of immigration on various aspects of the labor market has been extensively researched, its fiscal impact has received less attention. In this study, we applied the national transfer accounts and demographic decomposition to estimate and compare public transfer for immigrant and native in Canada between 1997 and 2015. Next diapo, please. In today's presentation, we look at the NTA by resident status, the method and data source and measure of comparison. Then we will analyze the trend in the measure over the study period. And finally, we will look at the source of differences in transfer between immigrants and natives. But before getting into it, let's look at some statistics of immigration in Canada. Next slide. For the purpose of this study, an immigrant is defined as a person born outside Canada, but living in the country as a citizen or a permanent resident. The 2016 census enumerated about 7.5 million immigrants in Canada, accounting for 32% of the population. And about 61% of immigrants in Canada actually live in the three metropolitan areas of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Recent immigrants, that's those arrived between 2011 and 2016, are mainly from Asia and belong to the economic category. And they represent 62% of the total. With that said, let's look at some basics of the NTA approach and how it's applied in this study. Next slide, please. This is the fundamental equation of NTA that we are familiar with. But in this study, we focus on the public transfer accounts. That's the TGI and the TGO, and the sub-accounts. Navo and Marriott have estimated TGI and TGO for Canada as a whole. So the first added value of this research has been to split this transfer between immigrants and natives. And next slide, please. This is done through the following formula, where IMM and NIT stand for immigrant and native respectively. The TA represents the transfer at a given age at national level. The HAT stands for the age profile of transfer before adjustment on the TA. And the S stands for the share of the population at a given age. This applies for native and immigrants similarly, but we can just subtract the immigrant's value from that of the total to get the native value. Now, where do all these data come from? Next slide. The adjusted transfer for Canada as a whole has been taken from Navo and Marriott 2020 as they are. The unadjusted profile of transfer are estimated from various surveys and census. The estimation is straightforward for some of them. For example, the unadjusted age profile of cash are calculated based on the slide survey and from 1997 to 2011, and on the CIS from 2012 to 2015. Others are estimated using proxies. For example, the annual component of the CCHS is used to construct the unadjusted age profile of healthcare costs using the number of total medical visits within a given year. Now that we have the data, let's look at the measure used to compare transfer between immigrant and natives. And next slide. The measure of comparison are net transfer, immigrant surplus, and the net surplus defined as follows. Let TIC be the per capita transfer for a given account for a residency status. Then we have the net transfer, which is defined as the sum of all transfer, inflow minus outflows across all ages, all sub-accounts included. This is computed separately for each residency status, that is immigrant and native. And then we have the immigrant surplus, which is the difference in transfer between immigrants and native for a given account or sub-account. Finally, we have the sum, or we have the net surplus, which is the sum of all immigrant surplus across all accounts or sub-accounts. But this can also be viewed as the sum of all net transfer, immigrant minus natives. With that measure defined, we can now look at the trend between 97 and 2015. Next slide. So now, please imagine that the lines are not there and only focus on the gray surface, which is the net surplus. We can see that prior to 2012, where we have a huge increase, the average net surplus of transfer has fluctuated slightly around 1,400 since 97. A positive net surplus of transfer implies that the average immigrant has costs to the state more than the average native. However, this overall positive cost hides important differences within each group and transfer component. Now let's look at the line in figure A, which are the net transfer for immigrants and natives. On one hand, we can see that the immigrants have had a positive net transfer over the study period. This positive net transfer for immigrants implies that they have received more transfer from the state than they contribute to its revenue. On the other hand, native has seen much lower and slight negative net transfer over the study period, a sign that they have contributed more to the public purse than they received from it. Putting these observations together, it can be concluded that the trend in net transfer is due to the fact that immigrants have consistently received more than they contribute, while native has received slightly less than they contributed. However, we still don't know how the difference between immigrants and native is distributed among outflows and inflows. This difference can be further understood by analyzing the immigrant surplus for each account in figure B. Here we see that over the study period, immigrant surplus for inflows has been positive, but it's trending down. For instance, it has dropped by about half its value between 97 and 2015. And if the surplus for outflow followed the same trend or even remained constant, the net surplus would have reduced and even reversed by 2015. Instead, the surplus for outflow has increased greatly between 97 and 2015, and especially from 2012, which is the reason of the spike we see in the net surplus area. Till now, we know that the difference between immigrant and native in net transfer is largely due to the difference in inflows. But how this difference is shared among various sub-accounts of inflow and outflow is still unclear. And we move to the next slide. When we look directly at the immigrant surplus for each account of inflow and outflow, we see a rather strange picture. For example, we see that element of inflow are actually shows larger surplus than those of outflows, which is not even consistent with the literature. And that's where the demographic decomposition comes in. Next slide. So we use the model of continuous change developed by UHC 2018, which allowed to decompose the difference between two summary measures resulting from the same process into a number of components, each representing the contribution of the factor intervening in the process. UHC demonstrates that the difference between the summary measure can be decomposed into additive components, even if the process is a non-additive function of its covariates. Now, recall that our per capita is a function of the age-specific population share on one hand, and on and the age-specific transfer on the other hand. Using this as a functional process, the immigrant surplus can be written as a difference between the two summary measures, one for immigrants and the other for natives. Then we look at next slide. The immigrant surplus is then decomposed by creating a wrapper function G around the R package GMO-decomp, which take as argument the per capita function F, the immigrant covariates, and the native covariates. It will return a matrix composed of DAC, the demographic component, and EAC, the economic component, which are the age-specific transfer components. The element of YEC can then be summed up to reveal the immigrant surplus for a given account or sub-account, and the net surplus as well as the respective demographic and economic components. Now let's look at the result of the decomposition. Next slide. Looking at the adjusted transfer, we now see a much reasonable picture, saying that much of what appear to be a difference in public transfer are actually difference in age structure. Let's first look at the first column, the total column. We can see that adjusted net transfer follows the same trend as the per capita net surplus, but the levels are much higher. Furthermore, the overall negative sign of the demographic components indicate that the age structure is much favorable to immigrants transfer-wise. But what is more interesting is that adjusting for the difference in age structure actually reveals that the sub-account of sales and income tax are the two most important sources of disparity between immigrants and natives, accounting for 85% of the difference in net surplus. In summary, the results from this study show that despite a favorable demographic, immigrant has caused much public fairness than natives. Labor market imbalances are indeed the main source of the cost of immigration in Canada, but are not revealed until the effect of age structure is taken out. Therefore, per capita comparison of NTA account across groups may be heavily biased if demographic structure is not the same for the compared group. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Thank you. So now we have the third paper. This is a paper by Juha Honkatukia and Bristo Vaitinen. They are going to talk about the costs and benefits of the welfare system in Finland using a computational general equilibrium model with intergeneration accounting.
Hello, my name is Juha Honkatukia and I'm working as an economist with the National Institute for Health and Welfare in Helsinki, Finland. I'm going to be presenting a paper written jointly with a colleague of mine, Risto Vaitinen, who's a specialist in pension systems in Finland. The goal of our research is to integrate the micro-level register data of benefits, the recipients, and healthcare into the CG model of the Finnish economy that can be then used to analyze various policy proposals that are in the works. The background or motivation for this research stems from the cost of public healthcare system. As you probably know, in most of Nordic countries, Finland included, healthcare and social care are mostly funded from the government coffers, and that means that the future of it all is very much a policy issue. If you will, it's actually a question of the Nordic welfare state model as well. Expenditure depend very heavily on the age structure of the population, and Finland, like most European countries, is becoming relatively older all the time. It's forecast that the share of working age population of Finnish population is shrinking well into the 2030s, which means that fewer workers are going to be facing a growing bill from the health and social care system or welfare state. Present government is attempting to do something about this to make the care sectors more cost effective and to save some room for the volume growth that is anticipated. Unfortunately, at least 4 previous governments have been trying to do the same, and it hasn't been very successful. But maybe it's the case that as the future is lying, or the problems are lying closer at hand, this time the reforms will actually be seen through. So what we want to do in our studies is to develop tools that can be analyzed, the effects of the policies, and especially the implications to intergenerational welfare distribution. The drivers of health expenditure and social expenditure as well. Basically, the population, it is forecast that, as I thought, that the aging, the share of the elderly is in the increase. But then it's also the case that the unit cost of treatments are higher for older people than younger people, because they tend to need more labor-intensive, round-the-clock care with many of the typical diseases that older people get. This is at the core of our study. The National Institute for Health and Welfare is the official that's in charge of these registers. So we know at the level of something like 700 or 800 different treatments what the costs have been, whom the treatment has been given, who did it, and so on. So we'll be able to sort of allocate very accurately the costs of treatment in different age groups, for genders, and so on. We try to update this register yearly. The last time it was fully updated was actually 2017, but the pictures that I'm now showing are from the 2015 version. We do the projections here up to 2040 because it's based on regional sort of data. But at the national level, we can actually go well into the 2070s. And then that's something that we actually do continue. Well, here's the big picture of how the costs are distributed across age groups. You can see that there's a marked rise in the unit cost per patient as people go older. Males tend to have the benefit of a female companion in better shape than themselves when they are older, and that means that when females are getting sick, it's often the case that they are elderly widows, meaning that the society sort of has to face the bill. But when they're treating their sick older husband, then it's actually not borne by the society, at least not to the same extent. But other than that, the pattern is pretty clear. As you get older, you need more expensive treatment. The share of growing share of the elderly population is also seen in, for example, the old age dependency ratios, which are projected to grow from something like 35% to almost 50% by 2040. So you can see the urgency of doing something about that. Here's a projection of the public healthcare expenditure might look like in 2040. The projection that we have is that the total expenditure is growing by something like a third from 2015 to 2014. And only 6.8% percentage points of that is actually due to population growth. And 25 percentage points is due to expenditure per person rising, and that's explained by the aging of the average patient. Well, in the macroeconomic modeling, we are interested in things like this. This is a picture of yearly growth rates of GDP. AWG is Aging Working Group, which is a European sort of a joint effort for determining fiscal sustainability. For Finland, the AWG GDP forecast is hovering between 1 and 1.4%, and as you can see, the health and social care volume growth is well above projected GDP growth for most of the next 2 decades. So what this implies is that the share of care costs is actually rising. Our model, the CGE model, is called Finnish Applied Generic Model. It's been in use for something like 15 years now. For these purposes, what we're doing is that we're aggregating it into a level of commodities and industries which is matching what we know from household surveys. So we'll be able to sort of construct consumption baskets for each age cohort and allocate the income from different industries pretty accurately. The base data that we have goes to something like 200 industries, but for our purposes, that sort of disaggregation release is kind of beside the point, because our approach and our focus here is more on the implications of intergenerational issues. We cover all the public care providers and also the central and municipal governments which are in charge of tax collection. So we get the fiscal issues covered as well. Population is by age. Each cohort we treat as a sort of a neoclassical utility maximizer, so that when something happens to incomes or relative prices, you get the usual responses to the consumption and so on. We are calibrating it to those AWG profit projections and then our own projections that have to do with the care sectors. And with it, we'll be able to analyze whatever policies are being implemented during this government seat when they start reforming the care sector. So I'll stop with just a picture of how complete our analysis is. We don't only cover the social and healthcare sectors, we also have all the other social benefits which are distributed, basically income redistribution by the governments at the different levels. And then we also have the pensions model. So altogether, the big problem that we want to tackle is that according to our projections, the GDP share of all these welfare state services and benefits is rising by almost 4 percentage points by 2040, unless something can be done with the effectiveness of it all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, Juha and Risto. And now I'm going to invite Rafael Hoffman from the World Bank to please make your comments about the 3 papers. Thank you so much, Rafael.
No, thank you, Cassio, and thank you, everyone. You know, I find these discussions amazing and very interesting because, in general, what I do most of the time is I start with my work and my analysis where mostly, not completely, but mostly these 3 papers stop. What you guys are doing, and it's very strong and very clear, is documenting issues and not just saying, well, you know, health expenditures will grow, and so we have a problem, but showing when, how, by how much, and why. And so creating the right context for somebody to sit down and say, okay, what do we do about them? When the paper by Gilbert, Julien, Yves, and Marcel discusses the difference between immigrants and Canadian-born individuals in terms of the deal they get in fiscal terms with the government. Again, you are describing it and you are documenting very clearly where the difference is coming from. But you are not necessarily advancing into discussing, okay, what do we do about it? You're not even entering a discussion on whether that's a problem or not. It's just a fact, which this is not a shortcoming of the paper, it's just that this is the first stage of the discussion. In what I like to do and in what I do in my job every day, my immediate reaction is to say, okay, this is a fact. Now, first, is this a problem or not? Am I worried about that, or this is just the way it should be? if I'm worried, is there anything I can do about it, or I have to live with it and find a way to survive it? Because we know that in public policy, that's a challenge, and many times there is nothing you can do about it. And what I find interesting here is that the challenges are different in the different countries, and this is obviously linked by through to the demographic transition, how advanced the different countries are in the transition, and how advanced they are in other aspects of social and economic development. So let me go on that paper by paper, again, not to discuss what you've done, because I can't do that now, but to use what you've done to think about what I will do next, and maybe give you some ideas on where to bring the discussion. First, on the, let me put my notes here, okay. On the paper by Michael on the Philippines. I think that your description is very strong. I think that what you're saying is very clear. The Philippine government decided to expand coverage of the health system to everyone. That by definitions basically means to include the poor, because the richer people already have some kind of health coverage. So this is good, this is progressive, this improves income distribution, and it's very welcome. But of course, the challenge is how you pay for it, and not necessarily how you pay today, but how you pay in the medium term. And what you are showing, again, that could be expected, but you're putting numbers in it, and so it's much stronger, the discussion, is that aging will probably rise the cost of universal health coverage. And so there are two challenges. One that you advance on, which is, okay, how to manage it in financial terms, that is how to smooth that process of increasing costs that you cannot avoid, but you can smooth. And second, how you can finance it, whether you can find money somewhere else. But there is something you don't do, which I found very interesting. You don't discuss other changes that will happen at the same time that people will age. I understand that when we are doing papers and when we are doing models, we need to somehow, decide whether we start ignoring reality because we cannot have a general equilibrium model that includes everything every time we discuss anything, because then it will be impossible. I fully support that. But there are some things that I think you should keep including in the new iterations of the work you are doing. And particularly, there are two of them that I think are important. One that is more clear in the discussion that we saw on Finland is the question of technology costs. The numbers you show, the tables you show, it was very quick, but it was clear that the cost of health care was rising everywhere for everyone at every age. And the per capita were rising really fast for everyone. And that probably has to do a lot with what the technological cost of these services, and that's something important. But even more interesting than that is, what about the epidemiological profile changes? What about the epidemiological transition? Will people in 2040 get sick of the same things they get sick now, or that will be different? Most likely will be different. And if that's so, we should open the discussion on how that will affect expenditures in 30, 40, or 50 years from now, because that will probably change. And again, this is not a criticism of the work you did. All I'm saying is that this is the way I will carry out in the future the discussion. And let me change the order simply to stay on the health discussion. The discussion that Johan Risto presented on Finland is also very interesting. What is fascinating for me on the discussion, especially when you look at it next to the Philippine discussion, is that this is about a country that basically has not completed, but is very close to complete the demographic transition. And I was smiling when you guys were making the presentation, because we were showing what anyone working in a developing country will say: very small and very smooth and very minor increases in expenditures in the next 40 years. But you are worried about that because you're from Finland and you want numbers to be stable and you like small increases. But I was looking at Cassie and I think, okay, you know what? If Brazil could have these numbers, they would be so happy. If Argentina would have those numbers, we would be so happy. It's just a question of what we're used to. Those are not increases for us. Those is paradise for us because we are in the middle of transition. So things will, as in Philippines, will start scaling up very quickly in the next few decades, and it's not very clear what it would do. But that being said, I think that again, the most interesting questions also for Finland is, okay, what do we do? And what I think is a very interesting discussion when we put the two papers together is that looking at the numbers that we have in the Philippines, it's clear that you need to do something to control the level of expenditures in the future. You cannot have that level of rise in the future. And what the paper is doing is trying to advance some discussion on that. On Finland, it's not that clear. On Finland, I mean, it's going to be more expensive. It's going to grow faster than the GDP, so you have to find another way to finance it. But it's not that terrible. Maybe you can find some way to do it. So the discussion is different there, and I think it's open to a different discussion. On the second paper, which I left to discuss last only because I wanted to put together the two papers on health, the paper by Gilbert, Julien, Yves, and Marcel. Again, it's quite interesting. And the results you get are the results that you will expect a priori, but it's wonderful to have the numbers. Canada is a country that is making a huge effort to attract immigrants. And obviously, because of that, what at the end of the day they're doing is they are being more generous to immigrants than to Canadian-borns because they want people to come. It's a basic rule of any market. If you want to be attractive, you have to be more generous with people who come than who are already in. That's what phone companies do when they want you to switch your cell plan from one to another. You're more generous. And that's okay. And it's wonderful that, again, that you can show where the generosity is and how it works. The one thing that kept me thinking is that the one question I will pose here, and again, I know it's a very difficult question to answer, but at least I will pose it in the discussion, is why Canada is doing this? It's because they are very nice people. The Canadians are so nice that they are willing to help everyone in the war and they're very generous. Maybe so. We know Canadians are very nice, but probably they're not that nice. They have a rationale, they have a policy rationale behind this. And the rationale is that somehow somebody decided that making this expenditure, spending this higher amount of money on immigrants is a good deal for the country in the medium term. And why is that? I think that part of the reason is that they're thinking not only about the immigrants, but about the children of the immigrants and about the productivity that immigrants and their children and the children of the children will bring to Canada in the future. So the challenge that I'd like to pose to you, and again, I'm not asking you to correct your paper, I'm just saying I would love to see somebody thinking about this in the future is, okay, we know that immigrants are getting a better deal, and we know by how much, and I don't know where, and we know where. So the big question now is the society getting its money back somehow in the next 20 years, in the next 100 years, or it's just being generous for no good reason except that Canadians are nice? And I think that's a very interesting discussion. I'm discussing it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rafael. These were terrific comments. I mean, is this just informal comments? I mean, these were great. And imagining your formal review of the papers, how it would be. Much better than your old
It would be boring.
It would be boring, okay. All right, so let's do the following. Let's follow the order of the papers, and so each author can comment on Rafael's comments, please. React on Rafael's comments. So let's start with Michael. Please, Michael.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Those are very good suggestions about the epidemiological transition and including epidemiological transition and the cost. I actually have that section on epidemiological transition in the paper. It's just that it didn't make the cut for this 10-minute presentation. So what I showed there was that over the last 25 years, much of the change in health burden in the Philippines is more through the non-communicable diseases, and mainly because of increased behavioral risks. So mainly food intake and so on and so forth. About cost, that is not included in the paper. I just throw it under the rug, but that is a very good suggestion, and it's linked with Sangyop's suggestion to incorporate changes in prices based on historical costs. What we found here in the Philippines is that indeed there is some evidence of supply rigidities. What we found using our consumer price indices is that those services related to facility-based services that are covered by the National Health Insurance Program, they had a 2-3 times increase relative to those that are not based on facilities. So those are really good suggestions. I welcome it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Gilbert or Julian?
Yeah.
So thank you for your remarks. I want to start saying that my personal hypothesis was that Canadian immigrants have a positive net amount of transfer. I was thinking that because we are attracting pretty well, educated people in Canada thanks to the selection system. So I was not expecting something at least so negative, and it evolves on the wrong side. And you're right. We should say, okay, what about this now? And there is something about the labor market. I think that Canada as an economy does not valorize its immigrants worker properly. So I think it's another paper. Is it because of discrimination? Is it because of unfit on what kind of immigrants you try to attract? Who might not be the good one? I don't know. So we did this paper because we wanted to respond to some research that were showing like huge cost of immigrants and which are unrealistic papers. It's really oriented. I will not tell any author. Nobody's there. There is none of those authors are in front of me. But so yeah, basically what we did. So I think that we will work on explaining what's the next step. And I think that we are discussing now about a new research, especially on the labor market.
Okay, thank you so much, Julian. Now, please, Juha and Risto.
Okay, Risto tells me to go, so I'll take it up. Thanks very much for those comments. I think the point was very interesting about the differences between the three papers. Essentially, we're kind of dealing with the same issue, but we're coming from different angles, and so it made me think: is it really a problem? Well, we think it is a problem in Finland. The domestic awareness of the need for reform to keep it up, not to take for granted that the welfare model that we have at times seems to be lacking. So we want to sort of contribute to that discussion and then sort of underline the urgency of doing something about that. The technology point that Rafael made is interesting. I have an anecdote about that. Well, actually, I have two anecdotes. The first is that if you think as an economist, and if you think that the volume growth is something like a third the next 2 decades for Finland, just because of aging. Suppose that you have technological progress, productivity growth. Then the question is not why it's 30%. It's why it's not 45%. If we have 1% per year productivity growth, it should be more than 30%. And this is something that we, I guess, try to convey to the policymakers. If there's growth, if there's productivity growth, it should show up also in what we are able to put in the welfare system. The final anecdote has to do about the difficulty of predicting these technological things. In the 1990s, they were predicting that considerably more Finns would be dying of cardiovascular diseases than has actually taken the place. The reason is that they didn't know about this technology that's called, I think it's called Lipitor. So that sort of a medication didn't exist in the 90s. It only came a little bit earlier, a little bit later, and then that diminished the occurrence of cardiovascular disease quite dramatically, even in Finland. So technology, yes, it's important, but when you talk about medical technologies, they are really, really difficult to predict, as unfortunately we are learning now. But anyway, great comments. Thanks for them, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much.
No.
Thank you so much, Juha. Thank you. So I guess time is over, and we have in 10 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone, all the participants, for these great papers, and Rafael for the great comments. And see you in 10 minutes. Thank you so